Hello. Today we're going to be considering the concept that classical sculptures were not originally intended to be the static and rather sterile white objects we are nowadays accustomed to seeing on display in our museums. And we're going to be focusing on Roman statuary, specifically the relief sculptures recovered from the Antonine wall here in Scotland, to consider evidence for polychromy. Now that is the application of colour pigments that once brought these wonderful objects to life. So I think I will start, if I may, with this quote, which I think really nicely encapsulates the significance that colour represents to us and our lived experience. And that is that colour shapes our world in profound, if sometimes subtle ways. It helps us to classify, form opinions, and make aesthetic and emotional judgments. Colour operates in every culture as a symbol, a metaphor, and as part of an aesthetic system. And yet archaeologists have traditionally subordinated the study of colour to the form and material value of the objects that they find, and thereby overlook its impact on conceptual systems throughout human history. So what I would say to you is that colour plays a really pivotal role in our modern perception of and engagement with the world around us. And we experience colour in our everyday lives, in our landscapes and our seascapes, in the wonderful, rich, vibrant colours of the clothing that we wear, and also in the body art that we display on our bodies. Even in the objects that we interact with on a daily basis, as well as the jewellery that we adorn ourselves with every day. Colour is evident in the subtle, or possibly not so subtle in this case, shades of our hair and the different shades and colours of our eyes. Or on the imagery that we are exposed to, be that through artwork, television screens, or even, as is prevalent today, the digital technologies that surround us. And so thus we are not living our lives in monochrome. We are immersed in colour as a sensory experience, and we subconsciously expect to see colour wherever we look. Colour is subjective and it's culturally defined. It has power to transform the things to which it is applied, and it carries with it intrinsic symbolic and metamorphic significance and ways of being that transcend the purely visual, as it connects to other senses such as sound, smell and touch. And colour can also, for example, act as a medium through which people construct and express identities. Or it can even elicit an emotional response to representations of people, deities, actions or things. And so it's against this rich and vibrant background that we'll be considering colour on Roman statues from the Empire's most northwesternly frontier here on the Antonine Wall. And the practice of applying colour pigments to statues did not originate in Rome. We have ample examples from ancient Egyptian tombs and temples, such as these wonderful wall paintings from the Temple of Campbell in Egypt. And many of us are familiar with this wonderful painted sculpture of Nefertiti, or the richly decorated death mask of Tutankhamun. And pigments survive on other Egyptian sandstone statuary, such as the reds, the whites and black pigments on these statues guarding the entrance to the temple of Hatshepsut in Luxor. And there are numerous examples of painted statuary from classical Athens, including these life-size marble statues that once graced the pediment of the Parthenon, now in the British Museum. Episodic cleaning has scrubbed away many of the residues of pigments that were originally applied to these statues, but if you look really carefully, some evidence has survived in the hidden crevices and folds in the clothing worn by the people who are depicted. And so we can see that actually Athens was never white, but her statues bereft of colour have conditioned the artistic sensibilities of Europe. The whole past has reached as colourless. And we should consider that as we address these issues today. And touching upon some potentially quite controversial aspects of this topic, Professor Nell Painter, Emerita of Princeton University, has rather eloquently summarised the underlying perception of colour on classical statuary. And she says that colour in sculpture came to mean barbarism, for they assumed that the lofty ancient Greeks were too sophisticated to colour their art. By this statement, Professor Painter really cuts to the heart of colonialism and post-colonialism, and this concept of the ideal being pristine, white, pure and devoid of any colour. And even as we've seen with the Parthenon marbles, when colour does remain on ancient statuary, curatorial staff in the past have sought to wipe it clean by scrubbing off all of the residue as much as they can with wire brushes and harsh cleaning agents in order to reveal that pristine virginal white marble below. Moving on to Roman practice, we can have some evidence that statues were intended to be colourable representations of people and deities. For example, this fresco of Mars on the wall of the House of Venus in Pompeii shows really clearly that the statue is wearing a red cloak and a colourful helmet. And we know that this is a statue because he's on a plinth. Unfortunately, we do have some instances of rich, vibrant colours and gilding surviving on sculpture, and this is a wonderful example of a 3rd century CE relief of Mithras killing a bull from a Mithraeum in Castra Peregrinorum. It's now in the bath of Diocletian's Epigraphic Museum. From the House of Surgeon, also in Pompeii, we have a representation of a female artist thought to be reproducing a painting of Priapus from a statue in front of her. But I would suggest that it's perhaps even more likely that she is in fact painting the statue in appropriate colours as defined by her handy, portable painting with the image in front of her held by Cupid. So there's ample evidence confirming that these were never intended as these static, sterile, white marble objects, but rather they were painted in vibrant colours which brought them to life, created connections and relationships with the people who engaged with them. Here is a life-size statue of the Emperor Augustus, found in the Prima Porta. His cuirass, that is his armour in the front of his chest, is decorated in relief with various propagandist scenes representing his successes in the Parthian War, as well as subjugated provincials and various Roman deities, including Diana, Apollo and Sol. We can't see it very well here, but perhaps easier in this close-up. There are representations of Cleopatra on his shoulders and sphinxes. When the statue was excavated, evidence of original reds and blue pigments still survived, and these have been reconstructed onto a plaster cast in really bold and vibrant full colour. Now these are bolder than I would suggest perhaps originally would have been applied to the piece, but they are a really good representation and they help us to understand and connect with this statue. And similar reconstructions have been undertaken on this head of Caligula from Copenhagen with traces of original prolophrome. Now close analysis has confirmed that different shades of ochre and other pigments were applied in layers to this sculpture, and that allowed the artist to provide a lifelike representation of the emperor. Here is a plaster cast of that sculpture with the colours reapplied to it, bringing that wonderful sculpture to life for us, and showing quite authentically how that sculpture may have looked originally in the 1st century. Modern technologies are also allowing us to recreate sculptural relief without interfering with the original objects. And moving scenes like this from the Areopagus in Rome from static snapshots to a lifelike fluid scene that has a realism and permits almost a tactile and certainly emotional engagement with these scenes. So, turning now to put our Antonine wall sculptures into context, this is a mural barrier that is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and we can see it here at the top of Britain. The Antonine Wall was Rome's most northwesterly frontier, and unlike Hadrian's Wall further south, the Antonine Wall was made from a turf with a stone base, and it cleaved a route across the cultural landscape through the Clyde-Forth Isthmus. It was commissioned by the Emperor Antoninus Pius around 142, and it was short-lived, having only been used for around 20 years. 17 forts were positioned along the wall, and these were interspersed with fortlets and watchtowers. The wall and associated frontier infrastructure were constructed by the Roman legions, and these were the 2nd, the 6th and the 20th legions. How do we know this? Well, we know it because they are dedicated and records left behind in this exquisite body of evidence that we refer to as the Roman distance stones. And this is a collection of Roman relief sculptures with inscriptions that were dedicated to the emperor by those legions. This is the Summerson's Barm sculpture, which is inscribed, like all the other examples are, in very prescriptive and abbreviated Latin. And this translates to for the Emperor, Caesar, Titus, Aelius, Hadrianus, Antoninus, Augustus, Pius, to give him his full title, father of his country, the 2nd Augustan Legion built this over a distance of 3,666.5 paces. And these inscriptions serve several purposes. They are, of course, a record of the distances that each legion built of the frontier, and they were mounted onto the frames along the wall as a method of propaganda, insofar as the iconography on several depict Roman cavalrymen in the heat of battle, or with capturing of northern warriors whose hands are bound, as we see here behind them. There are other scenes upon other examples, which include Roman deities and religious practice, as well as legionary symbols. And these sculptures were designed to be highly visible, and they were placed in prominent places to convey a message to the widest possible audience. And that is a message of Roman domination and the subjugation of local peoples. Imagine how powerful this message would have been if it were painted in vibrant colours in the manner of this wonderful frieze from a temple in Nicomedia, northern Turkey. Now, this is a marble relief sculpture which retains traces of the original polychromy, and we can see these beautiful golden yellows on the goddess Roma and the Nike that she is holding as part of this procession. And we can see some reds being depicted on the toget Roman citizens that are part of that procession. And even here, we can really see clearly the reds coming up on the cloaks of the two emperors greeting each other in this wonderful scene. And we also have ample evidence that the inscribed letters from Roman inscriptions were often adorned with colour, and predominantly red, as we can see from this dedication to the Emperor Hadrian from Egypt, now in the British Museum. So in order to determine whether our Antonine wall sculptures were originally coloured, I have recently undertaken some non-destructive analysis on them. Now, the techniques used include portable X-ray fluorescence, which measures chemical compositions as X-rays are directed towards a sample, and they provide information of elemental compositions. I also use portable Raman spectroscopy, which is a technique that measures scattered light that's bounced off of the sample and provides a really good fingerprint of mineral compounds. It effectively measures the light scattered from single wavelength incoming light, that is a laser, as it's bounced off the sample. Now, there have been some challenges to overcoming using these non-destructive techniques on sandstone sculpture, and that's mainly because of the characteristics of the natural components of the stone, and that combines with the taponomic processes and harsh environments they've been subjected to in the ground for the last 2000 or so years. But it's also combined with the episodic cleaning that these stones have been subject to, understandably so. These techniques tend to work better on nice clean examples, and so all of these activities that have come before us have impacted how effective some of the techniques can be. And nevertheless, the results have allowed me to both physically and digitally reconstruct some of the pigments that were once applied to these wonderful relief sculptures. And that's particularly the case for the Bridgeness sculpture that we see here, that's now in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. Another example that has allowed us to ascertain some information regarding pigments quite nicely is the Summerson Farm sculpture, now located in the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow, where most of these sculptures are. And so this research confirmed that the sculptures were originally adorned in vibrantly coloured pigments, and I've even been able to identify what is largely a pretty restricted palette of colours dominated by reds and yellows, and these were applied to different sculptural features in rather a prescriptive way. So what we're seeing are things like minium red, which is a really vibrant red depicting blood on some of the captives, as well as on the beak of an eagle in one of the sculpture scenes, which I'm suggesting is a symbolic gesture of Rome feeding off of the blood of her enemies. We also see red ochres on the cloaks of cavalrymen and other soldiers, as well as a different red, realgar, and madder red on some of our letterings. The goddess Victory's dress had traces of yellow and white, which aligns with the representations we have of her in other contexts, as we saw from Nike in the Nicomedia relief sculpture earlier. Nike is the Greek representation of the Roman goddess Victory. And ochres were present on the faces of some of the individuals depicted as well, which aligns with some of the other evidence from sculptures that we've seen earlier in this presentation. And this is really groundbreaking research that has allowed us to reconsider how our Antonine wall sculptures would have been perceived by the original 2nd century audience, to the extent that we can now digitally reconstruct a scene from one of the best known examples of these distance sculptures, from Bridgeness at the eastern terminus of the Antonine Wall, and now on display in the National Museum of Scotland, Edinburgh. From closer up, it's really clear that the colours provide an added dimension to what is really effectively a pretty terrifying scene of battle on the left panel of that sculpture. Here we see a familiar image of a Roman cavalryman running down in the heat of battle a group of local warriors, and the one at the bottom has been decapitated, which again is a pretty brutal scene, and these different shades of red have been used to highlight the different parts of the scene. So we see here the red, minium red of the blood on this decapitated warrior. And from these results, we can start to imagine how incredible these unique frontier sculptures would have looked in full dynamic polychrome, including this example from Hutcheson Hill. Here we see a scene of a soldier from Legio 20 being bestowed with honours from probably Britannia. And he's flanked on either side with this familiar scene of captive, naked and bound northern warriors. Or even this incredible example from Braidfield Farm, dedicated by Legio 6. Here we see a depiction of an inscribed panel being held aloft by 2 winged Victories, flanked on the left by a bearded Mars in full panoply and Valor in Amazonian attire on the right. So my ongoing work will expand the material, geographical and temporal boundaries of polychromia on ancient sculpture, and that is assuming I'm allowed at some point to access material in our museums. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and you take the opportunity to pause for thought next time you look at a Roman statue and start to reimagine it brought to life in full, vibrant colours. If I may, I'd like to finish off by extending my most sincere thanks to the very many people and institutions who have helped me to make this research happen. And I'd also, of course, like to thank you for joining us today. I'm happy to take any questions from you. Thank you.